is the United States Grand Prix in Austin, Texas. Now, in the category of long-running races, I suppose, we'll talk a little bit about the race in particular a little later on. But let's start first with Daniel Ricciardo, who's making his second comeback of 2023 this weekend, some 2 months after breaking his hand at the Dutch Grand Prix during practice in late August. The context of this comeback's a little bit different, though, isn't it? Because he's already signed the contract for next year, something he obviously didn't have when he came back before the mid-season break. So there's nothing specifically on the line for this season. Do you think that changes the comeback of the approach to his comeback this time around, Matt? Particularly given we've got a triple header, he'll need to, I guess, re-engage his race fitness after never really getting it going during the mid-season break.
Well, he's got over the most difficult one, hasn't he? I mean, Qatar's been done and dusted. So are a lot of the drivers after that one, to be fair. It's going to be an interesting little run home now. He's got 5 races before the end of the season. They're basically a free hit, really, aren't they? Because nothing's going to be expected of him. He's recovering from injury, so there's going to be that. There's getting back up to speed. There's the triple header, which is excellent timing for him to make the recovery and the return, because he's now got 3 weekends in a car. It's as good as almost testing was back in the day when, you know, drivers were banging around for 30 or 40,000 kilometers a year outside of a race weekend. Obviously, they can't do that anymore, and that's the challenge they face. So, I mean, what can we expect? It's a big question because we don't really know where that AlphaTauri is. The car's changed since Daniel drove it last. Yuki Tsunoda has been given a hurry up by Liam Lawson, so he's probably got the rocket under him as well. And you know, Daniel's still not really familiar with that team. Yeah, he's had 2 and a bit race weekends, and he was in Singapore with the team, but he's still going to be learning, you know, names and processes and those sorts of things. And then on top of that, he's got the nuance of getting the car in a hyper-competitive field where a tenth of a second can put you in or out of Q2 or Q3. This is a big job that's ahead of him now. It's not disastrous if he doesn't fire straight away, because he's got next year locked away. This is pre-season testing, almost an extended pre-season testing session in many respects, because if he doesn't score points, well, that's kind of been the norm for AlphaTauri. So how is that any different to what's happened all year?
I think it is interesting, that comparison with Yuki Tsunoda. A lot of the things we're saying now applied when he came back the first time around for the Hungarian Grand Prix, which is that is his principal bar against which he's going to be measured. Tsunoda, as you say, has had, he's had a variety of drivers now to be compared against this year, but most recently Liam Lawson, who, in those circumstances, as you said, the car changed during Liam Lawson's tenure, was improved, certainly, but Lawson, by the end of it, scored points. And Daniel's yet to score points. He only had 2 races, of course, but yet to score points. Yuki Tsunoda's scoring points only sporadically. Of course, that's been down to the car. But there is an interesting, different comparison going on here. And certainly Tsunoda knows that he's had to lift his game again this year. It will continue to be an interesting teammate battle, I think, and particularly in the context too. And we've heard various people at AlphaTauri say this over the last month, that Daniel really contributes to the team. Again, after only 2.5 Grand Prix, I suppose, in the mid-season break, they've been appreciative of the way he approaches the challenge of improving this car. We can't say the upgrades are down to Daniel because they're in the pipeline much longer, but his influence will certainly be felt over a longer period of time. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what effect this, as you sort of say, kind of like a free hit last 5 races will have on next year's car. Now, a lot of the parameters for next year's car are already locked in, but it being evolutionary, there's still a way for him to sort of influence that and give himself a little bit of an additional leg up for next year when, well, he will be out of contract, obviously enough, and the next chapter of his career will need to be planned out. Maybe that next chapter comes a little bit earlier than expected, because I guess in parallel with this, while there's nothing directly on the line for Ricciardo, there have been Sergio Pérez's ongoing struggles. We've talked about him plenty this year, Sergio Pérez. But Red Bull Racing's language has changed a little bit again after Qatar, maybe become a little bit more urgent. Perhaps having seen how close McLaren was to Max Verstappen at the end of that race, admittedly it was a little bit of a weird and unusual race, but you could say we saw pure race pace, if you like, because of the tyre stints we talked about last week. Thought it was interesting too that Helmut Marko suggested Sergio Pérez might benefit from a change of team. That seems fairly explicit, even if it was in, as is the way with Helmut Marko, a media that was not English language speaking, as if someone wasn't going to find it and translate it. where do we assess the risk factor here for Sergio in the context of a variety of AlphaTauri drivers now really pushing hard for promotion, given the way that lineup's changed? Is it any more real than we kind of concluded around the mid-season break?
The pressure on him has only ramped up throughout 2023. Sergio Perez has to improve if he's going to keep that drive. It's as simple as that. If he doesn't, as you say, you've got Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda waiting in the wings. Liam Lawson's also there, rubbing his hands together, waiting for a berth in F1. Sergio Perez has to improve, and if he doesn't, he needs to match what he was doing at the first 4 races of this year, where he was a match or close to for Max Verstappen. Since Miami and then Monaco on top of that, he hasn't been deserving in most events of a Red Bull drive. His performances haven't been good enough for a car that dominates Formula One. To put that in perspective, Red Bull would still be in charge of the Constructors' Championship without Sergio Perez. Now that's this year, when Red Bull has a dominant car. Next year, that situation may change and probably will change as teams find ways to make progress and close that gap. So while this year Red Bull can effectively survive with one car, who's to say that will happen next year? Just look at what's happening at Aston Martin, where Fernando Alonso is absolutely carrying that team. Lance Stroll has similar questions to answer to Sergio Perez, really, but what's holding Aston Martin back in the championship is Lance Stroll's contribution, or more to the point, a lack of contribution. They're in a fight for Constructors' Championship positions, which are worth a significant amount of money, and they're sort of fighting with one hand behind their back, much as Red Bull is. It's just the difference is Red Bull doesn't have a direct rival this year. So in 12 months' time, that's going to be more important. We know Sergio has a contract for 2024, and I can't see that changing no matter what Sergio does in the next 12 or 18-ish months. I think Sergio will be there until the end of next year, purely because he's not performing to the point where it's detrimental to the team. It's not costing the team money. I mean, it might in Constructors' Championship terms, but at the moment it's okay. The problem is Sergio brings finance with him, and he has the backing of Carlos Slim Domet, who, if you're going to break a contract, you probably don't want to break a contract with Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world. You know, can easily beat Red Bull in court in terms of spending power. So, not to say that he necessarily would, or that it would go that way, but why upset that apple cart if it doesn't really matter? That's, as we sit here today, in 12 months' time, Red Bull sitting third in the Constructors' Championship to Mercedes and McLaren, although Max Verstappen's dominating the Drivers' World Championship again. Suddenly, Perez's position is untenable. At the moment, it's very close to untenable. He has to improve if he's to retain that drive for 2025. And the problem is, if he doesn't improve in 2024, what do his prospects look like in 2025? Where's he going to go? There's a few seats on offer, but do you want a driver who has had a couple of lifelines thrown his way already, and his head and his morale are on the floor? Because I think that's ultimately what it is. He hasn't forgotten how to drive. He's not a bad driver by any stretch of the imagination. He's a phenomenal driver, but he's a confidence driver. And at the moment, he doesn't have any confidence.